So Dennis, if you could, tell us a little bit about yourself and what drove you in terms of interest to this book. And look, I think about lots of things, but I don't then think actually I might sit down and write a book about it. So what was the driver behind that?
Yes, first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you for everyone coming today and hearing me speak for a little while. Hopefully I can add some value to you. In terms of what I usually do, so in my regular role, on a Monday and Tuesday, I come in, look at everything that's happened globally to whether it's wheat or barley, canola, pulse, cattle markets, and I filter it down to what's relevant to Australian farmers and industry more broadly. And then I travel the country speaking, again, to growers, to food producers, could be grain traders, logistical companies, and just sharing what I've learned. That could be, purely 12-month outlook on markets. It could be what's happening with global biofuels. And then I wrote a book. And it doesn't seem like the most lighthearted topic, war on wheat, but at the moment, given what's happening with geopolitics, I thought it was quite relevant. In terms of how I went about it, so I found an old newspaper database. It's called Trove, and I literally went day by day from the beginning of World War I to the end of World War II. So I went through 3,000, I know it sounds daunting, 3,000 newspaper articles, and created a story out of it. I was just curious as to really what drives markets, and I found that the biggest drivers in history have been wars and politics.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think that's a reason why I have written a book. That's 3,000 articles. That's very impressive. And look, I guess also you get to walk into a room now. You're a published author, so that's a pretty cool thing to have. When you look back over time, and you look through those 3,000 articles, and then you look also through what's happened. I'm sure you spend a lot of time looking at what has happened post. What have been the biggest drivers of price volatility, and why have they been such significant factors?
Like I mentioned just before, I think at one point earlier on in my career, I wanted to understand, before I went into all of this, I wanted to understand from day to day what really moves markets. Because if you read certain publications, it would say, wheat prices went up for technical reasons yesterday. And it's like, great, what's a technical reason? And what I found was when you look at conflicts, it's really hard to hide why things do what they do. You can clearly see when wheat is starting to run out in a country, or for example, like in World War I, the Turks blocked the Dardanelles and suddenly 1/3 of global wheat reserves are unavailable. So you can go, okay, that's exactly the reason for what drove markets. And when you find out what drives markets during a crisis, like a conflict, or during something like COVID, then you can analyze markets a lot easier, even during peacetime. So, for example, the whole exercise of the book and the conclusion of it isn't to say we're heading to the same scenario as World War I and World War II. The purpose of the book is to say, compared to what most of us have experienced in our lifetime, the environment's going to be a lot more volatile geopolitically. This is the extreme scenario, and we're going to land somewhere in the middle of where we are now and that. So that's kind of the purpose of the book there.
So a real sort of deep-seated curiosity around. I hear this, and therefore I'm not going to take that at face value. What are the key drivers? So when you look at those key drivers, have they changed over time? Like when you talk about trade flow blockages or conflict, have you seen that have a different influence today than maybe in the past?
While it seems like a lot of things have changed, in reality, a lot hasn't. So we can take the example of, let's say, the war in Ukraine and what impact that had on wheat markets. So initially, when Russia invaded Ukraine, global prices skyrocketed by about 100%. So they doubled in the span of a week. The reason was that both Russia and Ukraine accounted for 30% together of global wheat exports. So every third ton of wheat around the world came from that region. 10% from Ukraine, 20% from Russia. 100 years ago, when the Ottoman Empire, which is present-day Turkey, joined not the Allies, the opposite side, joined the Germans, they blocked the Dardanelles, which is a route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And back then, the exact same scenario played out. Russia, or the Russian Empire at that point, accounted for 20 to 30% of global wheat exports. And as soon as that route to the rest of the world was blocked, global wheat prices went up 100%. So literally, it may be a slightly different time frame, but it played out one-to-one compared to then. And for Australia, none of the vulnerabilities we had back then have really changed. So we are an export-oriented country. While we've grown as an industry, it's all been export-focused. And the biggest issue during a conflict is that freight disappears. So it's either sunk by the enemy, requisitioned by foreign governments, or it's simply too afraid to come to Australia because it's worried our government will take their vessels. And it blocks our ability to move grain out of the country. And whether it's 100 years ago or now, it's kind of a similar scenario.
Yeah, no, so when we look at that, you've obviously got countries like us, which are very big exporters. We've got countries that have a significant domestic market and domestic consumption, and then we've got net importers. But when you looked across the conflicts, did you see that there were differences in how those different types of, I guess, economies were impacted?
Like you say, there's certain countries that have more domestic demand. If you take Australia, we on average export 70% of our wheat. If you look at barley, it'll be similar. Canola, I think, is over 80%. And then you look at South Australia and WA, and it's significantly leaning towards the export market. So 90% could be exported out of there. That's our challenge. If you look at countries like America, they have a significant amount of domestic demand. So they have a biofuel industry where they use their crops, whether it's corn or soy or it could be canola from Canada, and they create fuel out of it. They have larger populations. Our population, while it's grown, in reality, the demand as broad hasn't been that significant compared to the increase in yields we've had in our production. So how well a market can withstand volatile periods offshore, say that's in the form of freight disruption, that depends on how much demand locally they have, because it acts as a buffer. If you can't export, what are you going to do with the grain? Oh, we're going to put it into fuel, we're going to put it into flour, whatever else. If you don't have that, the grain just ends up piling at ports and starting to rot. And sounds like a really grim and unrealistic scenario, but that's exactly what happened in both wars. So we produced a large amount of wheat. It got to the ports. It had nowhere to go. There wasn't any freight available to move it out of the country. And we just had to wait for the government to occasionally organize freight. In World War I, the Prime Minister at the time actually went to Europe and bought a shipping fleet, but it was only capable of carrying about a third or maybe even less than that of our total harvest. So the government had to step in and actually nationalize the whole industry. It sounds like such a foreign thing, but that's what happened last time.
And do you think is like in terms of the conflicts that we're seeing now, is that a reasonable assumption that we might see that again?
I don't think we're in that same scenario. No, a lot of the conflicts we're seeing right now seem to be regionalized to certain areas. Yeah, that's a tricky one because not myself, not large organizations even know what's going to happen in the sense of broader conflicts. Only the people at the negotiation table know that. But the main thing for Australia, it's not like no one can predict the future, but at least you can make yourself better prepared for a more volatile time.
And just on that, when we talk about preparation, what are the things that you would say broadly to an economy like ours that we should be doing to protect against those sorts of things?
So one of the things, what we can do is look in the past and say, what did the government and the industry do once they were in that scenario to help ease the issues that arose from, say, a broader conflict or inability to move grain out of the country? Because if we can see what they did back then, we could, in theory, prepare for it a little bit earlier and be better prepared for the future. So in World War II, eventually, the government got to a point where they built their own biofuels industry, so they started converting crops into fuel. You have two benefits. One, you actually have something to use the crops for if you can't get them out of the country. You have the benefit of a biofuel industry. You have something to do with your crops if you can't get them out of the country. And the second point is that you actually have a fuel source. So I don't know how many of you are aware, but 94% of our fuel last year was imported. 94%. I mean, that should terrify any industry. Because if there is a supply chain disruption, we won't even be able to fuel our critical industries. Like you're thinking about, we can't go to Coles, you won't be able to get an ambulance. So if we can at least partially improve our self-sufficiency, we don't have to be as dependent on overseas fuel supplies. And again, it's not saying that there's going to be a really broad issue that won't allow us to get fuel, but say there's another conflict in the Middle East and suddenly we can't get enough fuel. At least we'll have a bit of a buffer.
I was saying to Dennis before that this is a bit of a different experience because normally the people I get to talk to are much older than me, and I'm glad you just pointed out that I won't be able to get an ambulance. I'm not sure what he.
That wasn't the intention of that.
No. One thing, Dennis, that I think you hear lots of stuff that has come out of the Ukraine in particular around how resilient farmers have been. When you look back over these conflict periods, did you see significant changes in the level of production? So was that a part of the volatility driver, or was it business as usual and it was that trade piece?
So there's a couple of things here. The agricultural sector plays an incredibly critical role during a wartime, and I'll just focus on that because that's what the book was about. We as Australia acted as a supply source for the Allies, so whenever we could get our grain out of the country, we would supply. It could be the French, could be the British, the Americans, whoever else. At times when we didn't have freight, you could go, oh, you know what, to avoid prices declining and the government having to get involved, why don't we just produce less? But agriculture isn't like a factory. You can't just turn the lights off and then come back in 3 or 4 years. The problem with agriculture is as soon as you tell farmers to stop farming, they leave. And they leave the industry, and the industry shrinks, and it's incredibly hard to build it back up. It's the same case with a lot of industries. Why do we have so much government support during COVID for industries that couldn't function? It takes a very long time to build an industry back up once you've at least partially or fully shut it down. So during those periods, the government said, farmers, you're going to get a minimum price for your wheat. You keep farming. We're going to buy it from you every single year, and we'll just store it until we can get storage. And they did. So, for example, prior to, I believe it was World War I, on average, we had like 400,000 tons of wheat stocks lying around the country at the end of each year. During the war, it was like 4 million tons, so 10 times more. It was just at ports waiting to be exported. And the government knew that if it told farmers to reduce planted area, they're just going to eventually stop farming and leave the industry. There was an attempt at one point during the war it sounds quite crazy, but there was one point during World War II where prices actually dipped because there was so much production and they declined quite substantially. And there was an aggregation of countries, of Western countries, so Australia, US, Canada, Argentina, who came together and signed something called the International Wheat Agreement, which was an agreement to reduce the amount of area planted all around the world in those countries and get prices to move higher. The problem is, whenever you start messing about with how much farmers plant, you coincidentally also fall into a year where you have a drought. And when we tried that, towards the end of the Second World War, we actually ran out of wheat. We suddenly went into the opposite issue of too much. We went into a shortage, and there was vessels of American wheat that was going to war-torn Europe that had to be redirected to us, and not the best scenario, clearly. So the government's role was to keep farmers farming, and it would be no different now. So if you don't, industry falls apart, and it's hard to build it back up.
That's really interesting, Dennis, because you often think of a time of conflict as being a time where there is very scarce commodity around, and actually there's a lot around. It's just stuck in all the wrong places. Yep. I've got a couple more questions, team, so I'll get through those and then over to you guys. Dennis, do you see wheat as a fair indicator as what happens to other commodity prices? I know the book is predominantly around wheat, but did you see other commodities behave in a similar way? And was there any difference between your perishables and non-perishables in terms of volatility and that sort of thing?
When you say non-perishables, what would be an example?
Milk or dairy or meat or those sorts of things?
They acted in the same way. So, for example, for beef, there was one point where they just made all cattle and beef property of the Crown because they said the same exact issue is going to happen. All the products going to get to port and we won't be able to export it. Prices will decline, farmer margins will decline, and then farmers will go under. So it was largely the same. If you're an export-oriented industry, it could be sugar, could be wheat, could be whatever. If you can't export, it's the same problem for everyone. It's like kind of like a law of physics, but for exported goods.
And my last question. So, you did a huge amount of research to get through. You've read the 3,000 articles. You've probably read another 40,000 since. What's the one thing that really stood out that surprised you when you did your research and you sort of went, as you compiled the information for the book?
Oh, I think I'm probably not going to say the right one because I just can't remember it. But apart from the preparedness part, the interesting thing is a lot of government policies around the world, they occasionally seem new to us and novel, but they've actually all been played out in the past, just usually before our lifetimes. So, for example, I just talked about the international wheat agreement. That's the same thing that Russia and Brazil are pitching as a grain OPEC. So they said, we want to manipulate global wheat prices or global corn prices. How do we do that? Let's get together as large producers of this trading bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, BRICS, and we'll try to reduce planted area when prices are too low, and we'll boost prices. It's all been done before. It hasn't worked. And the reason is, the problem with that theory is if you as Brazil and Russia get together and you reduce planted area and prices go higher, everyone else is just going to sell more into the market and take advantage of those higher prices. It didn't work last time because Russia wasn't involved, and then the US, even though it was actually one of the drivers for this policy to increase prices by reducing planted area, it waited for everyone else to reduce planted area, and it actually increased it. So that doesn't quite work. And the other one is, you're seeing more and more countries say, why don't we not trade in US dollars? Why don't we start trading in, the example is BRICS currencies? So it could be Chinese yuan, it could be whatever else, Indian rupiah. That has also been attempted before. So, and I'm not comparing the politics of then and now. I'm going to strictly say that, not comparing the politics of then and now. But in the lead up to World War II, so Germany had a severe shortage of foreign currency like US dollars, British pounds, and it still needed wheat, it still needed oil. So it went to Eastern Europe and it said, you know what, we know you want to sell us things, we want to buy it from you. We're not going to give you British pounds or US dollars. Instead, we're going to open an account for you in German marks. And when you need something, you can come buy it from us. And, the Romanians and Polish people went, it's great, it makes sense. Well, we have machinery we can buy from Germany and whatever else. However, the worse the political relationship got between them, the more constrained Germany made what they could actually buy. And at the end, they said, you know what, you can buy typewriters and washing machines, and if you don't want to, you can just forfeit all your money with us. So, and again, I'm not saying that's the scenario that we're heading to, but when you hear these policies, they've all been done before. So it's interesting to know what the extreme uses of them can be, say when you're accepting a currency that's not a typical one you would operate in.
No, that's great. So I'll pass the microphone around, but if you could introduce yourself, and we have our expert here today, so we don't need any statements from the crowd. We'd love some questions though. So is there anyone who has a question?
Thanks, Dennis. Simon Vincent here from AgriFutures Australia. Saw you 2 weeks ago up at Evoke Ag, up in Brisbane, so good seeing you again. My question about biofuels, what you talked about 2 weeks ago, where are we at with the market in Australia? Obviously, you said there's one in the US. What's the current state of the biofuel markets, and what are the barriers of expanding it?
Great question, and we actually have all the ingredients to create a biofuels industry in Australia. We have the feedstock that comes from the farmers who are willing to grow wherever there is a margin. So if another crop needs to be grown because we want to make biofuels out of a specific crop, we have the farmers who will do that. We have the feedstock aggregators. We have all the established grain traders who can collect it. We have companies who are currently offshore who are willing to build facilities here. And then we have airlines who, in theory, could also utilize the fuel because you can put it into a plane and use sustainable aviation fuel. When I've spoken to large biofuel producers overseas, the one thing they've mentioned is that they said, look, Dennis, whether you look at the US or you look at Europe, none of those industries stand up on their own. It is more expensive, biofuel, a litre of biofuel compared to a litre of fossil fuel. It is more expensive, but the government comes in and creates an accommodative policy framework to allow that industry to grow, and they said it'll be no different here. So they said they're not set on specifically how the policy is going to look. It depends on what benefits the Australian economy and industry more broadly. But if the support is there, and hence the demand is going to be there, we'll build the industry. So say the government comes in and puts in a mandate on sustainable aviation fuel, saying by 2030 there has to be 10% used across the board in the industry. If they do that, those large biofuel producers, this is in theory, this is what they're saying, doing and saying are different things, but in theory, they say, then we'll feel confident that we'll have an offtake for that fuel. We won't just be building a multi-billion-dollar facility, and then, you know, the CEO of an airline who was committed to biofuels comes in the next day and says, you know what, it's too expensive, we've changed our mind. If it's legislated, they said that they'll be more comfortable. That's what they've said. What they actually will do in reality could be different.
Hi Dennis, Charles Tim from NAB. You said at the start of your presentation or your speech that Russia and Ukraine have about 30% equal share of market share in terms of global wheat production, and then again you said back in World War II it was about the same. Has anything changed since then in your studies over the last 100 years or so in terms of technology advancements in higher economic countries? Is there any change or anything you can talk about in relation to that?
Yields have gone up. So whether you look at Russia or Ukraine or the US or Australia, we're producing far more than we did back then. So we used to produce a 4 million tonne wheat crop. Now we produce a 40 million tonne wheat crop. But the countries who have the ability to have a large agricultural industry haven't changed. So Russia's just as big as it used to be from a proportional point of view. So is Australia. I don't think necessarily that's going to change. The one interesting thing I'm watching is it's not plant-based meat, it's cell-based meat. So that's where you can actually make meat by growing it in a lab using amino acids and sugars and energy. That's pretty crazy. And if you look at some countries who are incredibly food insecure, for them to be able to create their own meat, that would be incredibly beneficial for them, so they'll jump onto it. I think it used to be something like $300,000 to US dollars to create a burger patty, then it went down to $300. I think now it's even lower. So I think in the background there's a lot of countries and governments who are working on this. That would be a really big game changer, because to produce 1 kilo of beef you need about 12 kilos of grain. If you go down the road of some countries start producing this on scale. We're not there yet, but say 20 years down the road, what do you do with the 12 kilos of grain? That's something really interesting to watch. That could change the whole dynamic, but it's not science fiction. It's actually being done. Like in Singapore, you can buy a lab-grown chicken nugget. I think that's an interesting one to watch. Apart from that, large countries who always produced a lot of grain still do, and importers still import.
You're Dennis Darrell Anderson from Anvil Media. The problem that you're talking about is oversupply during war and our inability to get it out of the country, and it happened during that during World War I and World War II, according to the book, that was a problem that we had, and we did have at one stage, I think it was in 1944, 4.3 million tonnes of wheat sitting around hoping to get out of the country, which we succeeded in doing, as it happens. But equally, there's a problem in wartime. We had to, at times, you say in the book, import wheat to make up for shortages. Outside of wartime, we can see that there are significant peaks and troughs in Australian supply of wheat. Is there an alternative solution you can think of that actually wouldn't actually have a problem? You know, if we have a war and we have an undersupply of wheat and we can't get it in, then the biofuels industry is pretty much stuffed for that period. Is there another solution that could cope with both?
Well, and if I don't answer your question correctly, let me know. But the industry is working in a really broad variety of feedstocks that they can use for biofuels. So I'm hearing everything. There's so many different things. There's byproducts of the sugar industry. There's byproducts of the forestry industry. So I think from the feedstock perspective, it will be possible to do. In times when it's not possible, I think it kind of goes to the argument of if the government has to support an industry to be created, firstly, we have to figure out if it's worthwhile, or is it more worthwhile to spend money on other things. While it may be expensive to support the creation of an industry, and there may be times where it won't function as it should, the repercussions of not having a local fuel supply and the repercussions of not being able to get grain out of the country and the government basically having to nationalise the whole industry is also a very large cost. So it's weighing up the risk of not having enough fuel versus the risk of creating a biofuel industry, which will require government support and taxpayer money in theory, not in theory, in reality. And the scenario where we don't have the feedstock because we suddenly go into a drought. I mean, we're producing so much now that in theory we shouldn't run into that problem. There's been very few scenarios where we have had to import. We did during the 2018 to 2020 drought. So we imported, I think it was 30,000 tons of wheat from Canada. That was a one-off. It could happen. So we got to weigh up what are the risks versus the benefits. The benefit is fuel security in most cases where we have the crops and the feedstock. Maybe it's about diversifying the feedstock to make sure we can make it out of waste products that we can easily find no matter what the season's looking like.
Ian Dunn from Westpac. Just your comment about preparedness, which leads on from your question, I think, was it's easy to say preparedness, but we noticed when the COVID pandemic was on, no country in the world had 30 million masks on hand or little hand sanitizers, etc., and we had to run around making those before we could actually deal with things properly. It's kind of similar in the comment that we should be prepared for the next one. It's all about that preparedness to safeguard us. If the biggest problem when a war occurs or that kind of impacts us is the lack of freight, and that was a real impact for us in banking because our clients couldn't take advantage of the high prices because they physically couldn't get their wheat out of the country. What do you recommend we do with that? Or like, is the solution, in other words, instead of having a 20 million masks, we have 20 million ships on hand that we just, what government's going to fund that is my issue, I suppose. And would that be your solution and how successful would it be?
To just basically actually have our own shipping fleet as opposed to having domestic demand.
Correct, because that would seem to me to be the only solution would be to have enough ships that we weren't bothered by the freight shortage.
Yeah, you're on point. So either you create more domestic demand or you create the ability to export no matter what. I think, you're very right on that. One is the question could simply come down to what is an easier sell to the government and the public from that perspective, biofuel versus a shipping fleet. And also, the important thing about a shipping fleet is that you then need a military capable of protecting so many ships. So one of the benefits for America is that if you look at some of the world's largest grain traders, they're US-based and they actually have incredibly large shipping fleets. They're bigger than most other companies and probably some countries, actually. So the very big ones, you look at the ABCDs and the ones based in the US, they're some of the world's largest owners of freight. And in theory, they're also the largest because they know that they have the backing and security of the US government. That's one thing you'd have to ensure. So it's getting a bit out of my depth, but one, you create more domestic demand or you create more ships. So I remember towards the end of the book, I was reading an article from the Financial Times that talks about how many ships are actually domiciled as Australian that are freight vessels, and you can apparently count them on two hands, which is very concerning. So if we can develop that fleet 100%, the question is what's more expensive, and I don't know.
Okay, Dennis, awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.